Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. It is once again I, the notoriously sanctimonious RMB. Thank you for joining me on this Tuesday? It's Tuesday today. It's a day before my birthday, and I want to thank all of you imagination connoisseurs for being here. All of you members of the Post-Geek Singularity, and I can't believe how many new subscribers I've received. I mean, I have a relatively small channel that's grown by leaps and bounds in the last few days. Every time I post between Avengers Endgame and Godzilla, it's very funny. The Godzilla review has brought in a lot of new viewers to this channel that I don't think when they first watched, they're like, where's the review? So for all of you new viewers, I apologize for that. And all the people that say I'm just babbling on, I apologize for that too. You know, there's a thing. There's a process by which this channel works. I'd like to think it's different, but there's a lot of new people here. I want to thank you all, you new subscribers, for being here, being members of the Post-Geek Singularity community. And look, let me just get something right out of the way first. As many of you know, tomorrow is my birthday. And as many other people have pointed out in many of the chats, I'm fucking old. I don't feel old. Old is what can I tell you? Tomorrow, for those of you who want to know, I'm going to be 52 years old. And I've been getting a lot of people saying, yo, grandpa. I'm not a grandpa. I don't have kids. And my fond response is, well, I'm younger than my grandfather and I'm younger than my father. But so I'm 52. What does that mean? Nothing. It's how old I am. It just happens to be a reality. And sorry for some of you that I'm not young, but I've done a lot and my enthusiasm has not waned. So there you go. Tomorrow is my birthday. And I'm excited about being 52. I've never been 52 before, so I'm really interested in what's it like being 52. No idea, but you know what's great about it is I'm gonna find out, and I'll take you on that journey with me. As everyone knows, Robservations, these live chats. This is number 120. My God, it's brought to you by Lucky Tiger Men's grooming products for those men who want to look good and feel great. And I'm a big fan of Lucky Tiger Men's grooming products, as many of you know. I just used some facial scrub on my face, which I love. I love their all-over body wash, and I really like their liquid shaving cream. And if you are interested in Lucky Tiger products, and you should be, I would advise you to go to their website, getluckytiger.com. And when you check out, if you buy anything there, punch in PGS for Post-Geek Singularity, and you get 20% off on any actually your entire order, which is pretty cool. But I want to thank them for sponsoring the channel. It's been a lot of fun having them here. Now, man, as I talked about yesterday, I don't think even The Last Jedi, where the divisiveness sort of built over time, because Game of Thrones, it's almost like we're getting it shoved down our throats every week, which normally I would think was great. And I was quite excited about the six episodes of Game of Thrones in the 8th season. But man, I don't think I've ever seen anything that has caused this much, let's call it, discussion on the internet. It's crazy. And again, this ongoing conversation, I mean, I know that unfortunately I have been participating because of my, well, let's just say my Star Trek Discovery thoughts. So I have become what I would say it's part of the problem. The acrimony and the back and forth and the anger amongst the fan community, I too have contributed to as well. Even though I'm all about positivity and sharing what it is that we love, when I'm not getting what I want, I get mad. I shouldn't get mad, but I'd like to think that I'm not. I'd like to think I'm adding to the conversation, that I have something to offer to the conversation, being a lifelong, and I would consider myself a student. I've not only told stories in my life, but I've also been a student of storytelling my entire life, and I think a pretty astute one. I've read a lot of books. I've not just seen a lot of movies, and storytelling, the art of storytelling, is one of the things that I am most interested in. And you know, it's very funny, this new term, I think of it as a new term, this new term, plot armor, has become this favorite. I think it's a stupid term, but I also think it's cool at the same time. And I get if a character is wrapped in plot armor, nothing's going to happen to them because the plot needs them to continue. So storytelling be damned. The if a character is wrapped in plot armor, they're protected. I think the latest example of this is Arya Stark, who, and I love Arya Stark, I really do. And Maisie Williams, I think she's grown into be a fantastic actress. She's got great screen presence, but they've now spent 2 episodes of Game of Thrones this season following her running around battle zones from her point of view, which I find sort of interesting. And both the same director has chosen to focus on Maisie Williams and Arya Stark and given us sort of a ground zero point of view of what's going on through what she is experiencing. She's sort of become the proxy for the audience on the boots on the ground to know what is it like to be in these battles, which I find an interesting choice, especially because it's happened twice now, one in the Battle of Winterfell, and then, of course, in the siege or the the scouring. You know, I used to think about the scouring of the Shire. Now, if you guys haven't read Lord of the Rings, the scouring of the Shire was what happened after the ring was destroyed and Sam and Frodo returned to Middle Earth. They returned to the Shire. And they discover that Wormtongue and Saruman have taken over the Shire and basically burned it to the ground. Not in more of a figurative manner. But now we have the scouring of King's Landing, which, is interesting. But I'm not here to belabor that. I want to speak in more general terms today. And as you know, what I want to do is to read letters. And I always have good letters. And the reason I have good letters is because you send them to me. I'm getting all kinds of great letters. And for those who might be here for the first time or second time, my website, theburnettwork.net. This is the Burnettwork channel on YouTube. We have a website, theburnettwork.net, where people are sending me letters about whatever's on their mind, their reactions to things that I say. You can take me to task. You can criticize me. You can also offer your cogent viewpoints that are interesting and that I love to share with people. So letters I've been getting from people have been quite great. And I have a few, and usually the letters that people send really sort of stimulate the conversations that I have. And this first letter comes from a longtime viewer, long time in the last 4.5 months, but I've enjoyed his letters. And first of all, let me just say that, there's a lot of people that write me that I actually look forward to their letters. And it's great because I feel like I'm developing a relationship with people based on their points of view. Having never met them, I'm getting their pure distilled personality on the page via emails. And I like that because I feel it's really interesting to come to admire people or like people or find out that we are of the same mind about things. It's really a treat. And it means a lot to me. And this one comes from Mark Cote. And Mark Cote is a watcher, a listener, a viewer. And he's sent me a few letters, and I've always enjoyed reading them. And I thought that I would read this to begin with. Hello again, Rob. All this talk lately of verisimilitude, suspension of disbelief, and lazy writing has led to the writing of this letter and a sad admission from me, a self-proclaimed fan of science fiction. What is this admission? I don't like most science fiction. Now, this may at first seem a contradictory state of affairs, but it is easily explained. The truth is that I enjoy great storytelling, but the writer must have an excellent command of the language. Bad grammar and poor spelling are an immediate turnoff. So I enjoy a well-written story about great characters doing interesting things. I enjoy compelling narratives. And it just happens that my favorite genre is science fiction. So it might seem then that I am not a real fan. I know if I get a lot of grief from the less discerning in particular for not liking this or that modern story. But the truth for me, at any rate, is that I don't think much of most science fiction movies and shows. Indeed, I'd go so far as to say that most of them seem bad, if not terrible, even if only based on the trailers and reviews. Sadly, the same seems to be true for many modern science fiction novels, even the ones people are raving about, like Ready Player One or anything by Dan Brown. They just aren't good. Does this make me a snob? An elitist? Perhaps. Rather that, though, than suffer through the worst of the genre. Now, having said all of that, I've read perhaps 1,000 novels or more, many and likely most of them science fiction or fantasy, and I do consider myself a true fan. But I don't believe a fan has to like everything. Indeed, one can be a fan and yet like relatively little of what's out there, if quality is as important a consideration as story. If asked for examples of quality sci-fi writing, I could point to Heinlein, Clarke, and Asimov, of course, or Philip Jose Farmer, Andre Norton, Piers Anthony. But it gets a little tougher for me to single out newer authors of this caliber. Even my current favorite author, Neil Asher, is getting on. He's 3 years older than I. Surely there are those writers for whom a truly well-written and well-crafted story is the only one worth writing, and I'd be curious to learn of them from the Post-Geek Singularity community. Is there hope for genre fiction, or has the bar been permanently lowered? Is mediocrity rewarded as much or more as true talent these days, the way it has been with music? Let's discuss. Mark Cote. I love this. I love this letter. And one of the things I love about getting letters from people is I find them as compelling as anything else. You know, there's this thought that there's so much out there, whether it's YouTube, you can fall down. I've gotten to the point where I'm watching YouTube channels the way I skim through news channels. And I'm just learning a great deal. I love listening to, like I mentioned, I don't know the guy, I don't know his name, but I think it's his channel. I mentioned it yesterday, Ideas of Ice and Fire. He does pretty deep dive analysis into, like he did a great series on Dune, and I really enjoy what he's putting down. And I think this makes me think a lot about what are the great works of science fiction. And I grew up, as I've told you before, when I was 10 years old, I joined the science fiction book club, and I made it a point of ordering and reading a lot of the great science fiction I had read about. And at the time, I joined the science fiction book club when I was 10 in the wake of Star Wars. That's what led me to reading. I was already a big reader even as a kid, but I think I really got into reading because of James Blish's Star Trek, the novelizations he did of the Star Trek episodes, the original classic episodes. But it made me a big reader. I started there, and then with the science fiction book club, one of the first books I got was like The Sword of Shannara. I read that, and then it led me to. I wasn't a big fan of fantasy, to be honest, but I did read The Lord of the Rings, and I did read the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, the Stephen R. Donaldson books, and I read all the canon of Dune. Was one of the first books I got from the science fiction book club, and it blew my mind. I was 10 or maybe 11 when I read Dune for the first time. A lot of it was above me, but still, I really, really, really enjoyed reading classic science fiction. And the science fiction genre began with literature. I mean, you go all the way back to A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You go back to reading Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, and there's the especially in the 20th century, the canon of science fiction has been very, very rich. And if you've read a lot of science fiction, there was, up until, say, Star Wars, there was always a lot of pushback. When you'd go to a science fiction convention, it was not media-based. It was all about literature. And you would go and you'd meet novelists and you'd talk about stories and things like that. There was very few. I mean, when I was a kid growing up and going to science fiction conventions, like what were people talking about? Science fiction films. I mean, you had Planet of the Apes, you had 2001, pre-Star Wars, and then the 70s, in my mind as a kid, and then I discovered them later, there was so many rich, a lot of dystopian science fiction, but there were so many interesting science fiction films. You had everything from Zardoz or The Final Program or No Blade of Grass, The Ultimate Warrior. Did I say A Boy and His Dog? Rollerball, which I think the original Norman Jewison directed Rollerball has aged really well. Logan's Run, and a lot of these things like The Final Program, Michael Moorcock's book, based on Michael Moorcock's book. Logan's Run was based, of course, on a novel. The original Planet of the Apes was Pierre Boulet. A lot of 2001, even while it wasn't a novel first, it was sort of based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke. Forbidden Planet from 1957 was based on Shakespeare's The Tempest. But you could literally, there's about 20 movies in the history, beginning maybe with Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or you could always go back to George Méliès From the Earth to the Moon, or whatever it is. There was just not a lot of media. There was not. And on television, there was even less. I mean, you had Star Trek, of course, and Lost in Space, and then you had some anthology shows like Thriller, for instance, or One Step Beyond, and then, of course, The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. But there just wasn't a lot of science fiction, horror, or fantasy media that existed. I mean, there was a lot, in a way, there was probably a lot more horror films that were revered than science fiction films up to a point. And that might even still be true. I don't know what the numbers are, but for me, it was always about books first. The genre horror, science fiction, and fantasy began with literature, and the things that I wanted from science fiction, fantasy, and horror as a genre were first. They were literary concepts first for me, and then when I saw them brought to the big screen, or brought to the cathode ray tube, as Brian Oblivion from Videodrome would say, then I was always looking at what were the literary equivalents, and the reason, like, for instance, the early films of David Cronenberg that we now call his body horror period, beginning with Shivers, aka They Came From Within, Rabid, The Brood, Scanners, Videodrome, his classic period of films. Those to me were they had great science fiction and horror concepts, but they were very heady. And some of those movies, like The Brood, when I first saw The Brood, I've talked about this before, but I had seen They Came From Within the first time. I saw that on a double bill with Motel Hell when it first opened at a drive-in, amazingly enough. But the Cronenberg's early films, like Rabid, They Came From Within, and The Brood were heavily influenced by science fiction concepts. And one of the things, The Brood might be one of my very favorite horror films of all time, because it's truly, it's got this heady concept, the idea of psychoplasmics. Dr. Hal Raglan, played by Oliver Reed's Dr. Hal Raglan, psychoplasmics, the idea that you could externalize your trauma, or whatever it was that was bothering you. You could physically externalize it to get it out of you. And of course, Samantha Eggar's character, Enola, takes that concept a little far, and it was a little wacky, but definitely it was more akin to those, even though they were great examples of visceral horror films, there were very heady literary concepts being examined. And I think Cronenberg's work has always been very literary, even in his more overtly, like The Fly. The Fly is, I think, a very literary film. And when I think that's where I come from my genre leanings, is always sort of a literary background. You've got to tell me a great story for me to love your movies. Now, that's not to say I don't love, and I hate to say it, I understand the movie Star Crash is, I'll say it, well, it's not garbage, but it is a shameless Italian ripoff that came out in the wake of Star Wars. It's not a good movie. Now, I love it. I love Star Crash. Now, to me, when I watch Star Crash, I'm not thinking about fan service, even though I think the whole movie is fan service. It was made by a fan, sort of, and I'm not thinking about plot armor. I'm not thinking about any of that. What I'm thinking about is I'm watching a goofy movie that was put together, basically, to me, what fan films have become now. Star Crash was at the time. Fan films were then professional efforts. People got their fan films released theatrically, and I think Star Crash is one of the greatest examples of fan filmmaking. And I just loved it. But the funny thing about it is that now we live in a world where people are very possessory of their fandom, because back in the day, I don't think people were possessive of their media. Like in 1972, famously, the first Star Trek convention happened, but people watched Star Trek and they took the good with the bad. Nobody was arguing, or nobody said, this isn't what it's supposed to be. You know, there weren't those people who read books said science fiction, horror, and fantasy media wasn't what it was supposed to be. They dismissed anything that wasn't literary. So there's always been this kind of infighting, but now we have these beloved, venerable franchises that people have grown up with, that they've internalized their whole lives. And when those franchises they no longer provide comfort food or that happy place that we all expect of them, then everybody gets angry. In my mind, what makes me angry is when what I see as something that was very literary in origin and something that was very smart betrays what it was. And that's when I get angry, specifically about things like Star Trek. Which brings me to another letter. And this really look, longtime viewers are going to say, like, you picked this letter because this letter just comes at it from your perspective, your point of view. No, I never think about things as coming from my point of view or someone else's point of view. I try and come at things. I like truth. I'm interested in truth. And again, I was having this conversation with John Campia. I come from a position of, I don't necessarily think that all art and all storytelling, movies, television, whatever, is necessarily subjective. I don't believe that. I think that there is an objectivity. There is an element that runs through human endeavor, especially artistic endeavor, that is self-evidently good, because it taps in. I don't know what you want to call it. You want to call it Jungian. You want to call it, I don't know, the first memory. We're talking about like what Dr. Jessup was looking for in Altered States. Call it what you will. But I do think that the great stories that endure through time, the stories that Shakespeare told, whatever you want to call it, there is something in there that John says, well, that's not measurable. You know, you can measure someone's height and that's objective. It's true. But I don't think we've progressed far enough as a people, nor have we been so inclined to try and measure what makes a great story work, because we've thought about it as being subjective. But I really think that a great story has something universal in it, and we just haven't figured out a way yet to measure. But there's a reason why the AFI 100 Greatest Films list has 100 great films on it that have been universally recognized by most people, most experts, most people in the know as being great. And I think that there's something in there that we haven't yet quantified, but that doesn't mean we won't in the future. But so that brings me now to a letter that comes from John Dube. His last name is spelled D-U-B-E. It could be Dube, or maybe it's just Dube. I don't know, but I think John Dube. It's kind of funny. Maybe it's supposed to be funny, but I like your last name. But I like your letter even better. And let me share it with. This is a long one. You know what? This is a little dense, so I'm going to put on. I think I'm going to put on my glasses here. My little reading glasses, which are probably all smudged. So forgive me. Actually, they are kind of smudged. I don't normally wear glasses, but on this one, I'm going to put my glasses on and read this one. So this is from John Dube. Dear Rob, first, I'd like to thank you for a great show. I don't get to watch it live often, but when I get into work, usually around 6 a.m., I have the previous day's Robservation on. I appreciate your calm, reasoned, and inclusive take on all things genre, and it gets my day off to a thoughtful start. I'll confess to being a little intimidated writing this letter, as you have so many articulate and thoughtful listeners and contributors, but I'm going to give it a go because I'm very invested in the topics that you've been discussing, especially Star Trek, being an OG fan of the show. My day job is history teacher, and I teach a class in pop culture. So my commentary is going to take a decidedly historical approach to some of the issues that recent Robservations have addressed, especially around Star Trek Discovery. Although I think you can insert most recent genre topics, Game of Thrones, for example, and still make the same points. Pop culture, like any deliberate construction, is a product and a reflection of the times in which it is produced, and Star Trek Discovery is no exception. I don't want to get too political here, but we live in very divisive times where social media allows everyone to have an opinion and be an expert on every topic. This has led to what I would call a tribalized culture of opinions, where if one takes a position, they put their truth stake in the ground, which promotes an equal and opposite response, and on it goes. Again, not to belabor the point, but this reflects the social, technological, and political climate of our times. The beauty of Star Trek, especially the original series, was that it ran counter in many ways to the zeitgeist of its time, the 1960s. Let's remember that that decade was also very divisive politically and socially, with unpopular wars and protests involving civil rights, the counterculture, and unpopular political leaders and policies. Rather than embrace the darkness, Star Trek showed us that humankind had the potential to transcend those ephemeral differences and become the best versions of ourselves. I'm reminded of an episode of TOS, The Savage Curtain, from the third season, when Abraham Lincoln is beamed aboard and upon meeting Uhura says, "My, what a charming negress." Lincoln then realizes he may have offended, and Uhura's response is so perfect. She says, "In this time, we no longer fear words." A simple and elegant line which highlighted the racism that existed in the 60s, but offered a vision for where we could go and who we could be. TOS gave us a future to live up to and strive for, rather than simply echo the difficult times it was being made in. Contrast that with Star Trek Discovery, which, rather than offer a vision of who we could be, simply reflects today's divisiveness rather than transcending it. I want to pause here for a minute just to let you know I consider myself liberal, a feminist, and a firm believer in social justice. So my critique of Star Trek Discovery is not so much about the show or its stories, but rather how it chooses to deliver its social, political, or technological commentary, which is with a sledgehammer. In Star Trek Discovery, we don't have empowered women. We have overbearing ones who are right about everything, and by virtue of how they and their agency are presented, diminish everyone else, especially their male counterparts. That isn't Star Trek. That's overcompensation. I am, of course, ignoring the other problems the show presents, like respect for chain of command, etc. That may be another letter for another time. Here we have simplistic politics in place of nuance or complexity, such as how Klingon antagonists are presented in Star Trek Discovery Season 1 versus, let's say, in the original series Errand of Mercy or Day of the Dove. In Star Trek Discovery, we have technology run amok in the form of control, an AI that's already an AI but doesn't know it's an AI in Season 2, versus ruminations on the dangers of technology like the ultimate computer from the original series or even the Doomsday Machine. My biggest complaint about Star Trek Discovery, though, is how none of the characters have earned anything. So why should we as an audience feel any affinity or allegiance to or for them? The discordance between what Star Trek has always been versus what it has become, was brought home for me at the end of Season 2 of Discovery, when Burnham and Spock have that conversation that basically drives Spock's future actions and sets up his eventual relationship with Captain Kirk. To me, this was such a betrayal of what the character Spock had earned, his humanity, from the original series through the movies, that the power of his journey, that for me culminates when he weeps for V'ger, was attributed to his sister, who appeared to be more Vulcan than an actual Vulcan. Was one more a desecration of canon than the mere destruction of it? In fact, my wife, a casual Star Trek fan, but Spock is her favorite, refuses to watch any more Star Trek Discovery because of this new characterization. So, getting back to my original premise, this is the biggest problem that Star Trek Discovery has from a pop culture standpoint. It isn't an innovative take on the things going on of today, and it doesn't advance anything. It simply regurgitates and reflects the depressing what is-ness of today's world. And if I want to be depressed, I'll turn on the news or look at my Facebook feed. John. P.S. By the way, I don't consider your critiques toxic fandom. Rather, we, lovers of Star Trek, need someone like you with the passion, knowledge, and platform to remind the people who control Star Trek that it is not a commodity to be bought, sold, or branded. It has a logic, a DNA, and yes, canon that is at the heart of its longevity and pop culture impact. And until and unless CBS gets that, they will never truly expand Star Trek. They will simply destroy it. Well, I found that to be an incredibly fascinating article and a great take. And I think that also applies to, say, the response that fans gave to The Last Jedi. I think it's a great response to what we're now seeing with Game of Thrones. And in the case of Game of Thrones, what I find really interesting is, as I said yesterday, it used to be a story about the interpersonal, all great stories, it doesn't matter what they are about the interpersonal relationships of human beings with one another. I believe that stories, in whatever form you choose to consume them, whether it's books, short stories, comics, or in the case of the modern age, the thing that attracted me the most to stories, cinema, television, of course, but movies. Movies were always my jam. But what are movies? What is really any story but sort of ruminations on human truths? What is it like to lead our lives, which are basically finite? We never have enough time. We want to find love. We don't want to be alone. We want to know if there's meaning in the universe. All stories are sort of derived from those desires. And then we're hoping to make sense of our own lives, get some kind of insight into our own lives by watching the great stories that affect us in some way. And I think that what Game of Thrones was more than anything else, it was our own lives reflected on a scale where the whatever was going on in Westeros was in some ways a reflection of all of our lives, whether the political backstabbing, who we loved, and perhaps we loved people we shouldn't. But the whole story of Game of Thrones was really about people in rooms talking, just like some of the best Star Trek episodes. I keep thinking about Measure of a Man. Measure of a Man, you have Data's entire existence in the balance, and the whole episode is really set in a courtroom. I mean, yeah, we go to other standing sets, and yet it felt epic. What was at stake was epic, because what's always at stake is the human soul. And again, what I find very interesting is that, and I'm guilty of this myself, I've internalized Star Trek, the universe, the people, and what it means to me from almost the way, in a religious way, what it tells me about my own humanity, the examples, the characters and the situations, what they're going through, remind me of what the best of humanity can be for the most part. And there was a universality to, as our letter writer pointed out, a universality to the original Star Trek, because all the great stories, even though you're working in genres like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, I mean, Shakespeare, his writing was definitely genre. It depends which story you want to read. You want to talk about ghost stories, you want to talk about romantic stories, you want to talk about whimsical fantasy stories. I mean, Shakespeare was a genre writer, and yet his stories had so much truth and reality in them. They spoke to all of us, which is why they've endured. And now I think that, as was pointed out, Star Trek was never about it. It reflected back on us, on the times we live in, by telling action, adventure, science fiction stories in that context. But it was really about what was going on allegorically about us today. Whereas Star Trek Discovery, I don't think does as good a job of that. But I think the best science fiction, I think about, what do I think are the best science fiction films that have been released? What are the things that have spoken to me just off the top of my head? Uh, Children of Men, Ex Machina, Never Let Me Go, Her. To me, Her is one of the finest stories ever told about the coming singularity and what AI could mean to us. And I think Her is actually devastating. It has a moment uh, when Joaquin Phoenix finds out a certain bit of information that literally, when I first saw it, I was like, it was one of those revelatory moments when you're like, oh my God, my heart literally, that physical sensation sunk in a movie like Her, because the ramifications of it were startling. So I always think that it's, now there's all this talk and we've seen it. I certainly didn't get what I wanted out of Star Trek Discovery. And a lot of people didn't get what they wanted out of out of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Certainly, I think a great majority of people, and to be fair, there's a lot of people that are really loving what Game of Thrones has been doing this season, but there's a lot of people who don't. And there's a lot of people who love Game of Thrones that aren't getting what they wanted out of it. And as I said yesterday when I was discussing this, I think the problem with Game of Thrones and the Twitter thread that I read, which I stand by, I thought that was a great Twitter thread, that what we aren't getting out of Game of Thrones is it's actually changed the kind of show that we loved. It was all about the interpersonal relationships. And what was going on was operatic in nature. It was very Shakespearean, but really the show was about the interpersonal relationships with people. And then once a season, or maybe twice a season, we used to get in the 9th episode a giant conflagration of some kind that was an externalization of all of the emotional turmoil that had been going on in Westeros up to that point. And it all came to a head, but they would use these big battles or these big sequences to inform what had been going on an interpersonal level with our characters. And in this season, because the last 2 seasons have been so rapid fire, what we're getting now is the characters have taken a back seat to the actual plot, and people are getting angry. And again, when you're following Arya Stark around twice now through the ravages of war, I wonder, and as I'd said before, what does that mean? Like, is that what we want? That wasn't what Game of Thrones is about. And as we saw, when many of our characters in the second episode, a Night of the Realm? Is that the name of the? I forget. A Night of Winterfell. I don't remember what the episode is, but when Brienne gets knighted, and when they're all sitting talking, I mean, those are the scenes that Game of Thrones was built on. Watching these great characters that we know and love having conversations, having these kinds of debates, all the special effects and all the set design, none of it matters. It's the characters. The Burnett axiom: never put your universe before your characters or your story. So it really comes down to, when we as fans aren't getting what we want, like, what does that mean? Like, I talked about, do our creators owe us something? I don't think our creators owe us, the audience, anything. What they do owe is whatever franchise or whatever the story there is that they're telling. They owe the story that. They owe the story that's being told. They owe that story truth. And the question that I've been grappling with, especially over the last couple of days, is when I'm following Jaime Lannister or Cersei Lannister, or Varys, who had plans upon plans upon plans, and we get to an ending where the endings that they have don't, and a lot of people would say, oh, no, they ended the way it was all foreshadowed. But from a literary perspective, where all of these genres come from, were those endings literary enough? They might have been foreshadowed in certain ways, but in other ways they necessarily weren't. Was the ending desirable? And what's really interesting is all great stories get to take characters to an ending. Whether it's satisfying or not remains to be seen, but you still take those characters up to a point. Now, what was so great about Game of Thrones is it was the interaction between characters that was so great about that series. The actors and the characters they played made that show what it was and why we wanted to watch them. And when these characters, when the interplay and their place in relation to the other characters, in my mind, should be the most satisfying way to end those relationships. Perfect example to me is Shawshank Redemption. At the end of the Shawshank Redemption, you see these characters are interacting with each other. And then, of course, we're left with Red's perspective. And he's literally telling us where he's at in life and what does it all mean to him. And at the end, we get this cathartic meeting of the two of them at Zihuatanejo, and it ends with great satisfaction for the audience, I think. Now, with these, the way Game of Thrones is ending, I don't feel that we as longtime viewers have achieved. It's not whether we want things to happen or not, but the story itself that we've been told over the last 8 years, was that story from a literary standpoint ended effectively. And that's what I obsess over. And it's not for me necessarily to say whether it's right or wrong, but I do believe that great stories, no one's ever bothered to do this, but great stories, there's a reason why things become popular. Why has Game of Thrones permeated the consciousness of the world the way it has? I'll bet you that one day somebody will figure out a way to measure stories. And it probably will be a way that it'll be brain patterns or whatever it's going to be. But they'll be able to measure, and you will find out objectively that there are ways to tell stories that are better than others. We just don't yet. I don't think anyone's actually ever been inclined to look at that. Maybe deep learning and AI or something like that, it will happen. But at the end of the day, that I think there's a reason that people respond to things the way they should or the way they do. And why is the AFI 100 Greatest Movies list pretty much the same year after year? Why have classic movies maintained their status? Why have classic novels maintained their status? And I think earlier, the fact that science fiction, Mark Cote was saying that science fiction does not mean as much to him as it used to. Well, I think because the bar has been lowered. I think culturally our society has lowered the bar. We're not as demanding. I mean, and also as a culture, we are more forgiving of say, I think our entire culture has been sort of in a way diminished. We don't expect enough of people anymore. Why that is true, I'm not really sure, but I think that's definitely, in terms of science fiction is a very heady genre, and the best science fiction asks a lot of its readership. And I think that we're living in a world that perhaps maybe doesn't ask as much as it probably should. I don't know why that is. And this idea that, I mean, I'm not an elitist snob, because I'm not, because I tend to like all people and of all walks of life that I meet. But I think we do need to be demanding more of ourselves and other people. That's what civilization is all about. Civilization's tough and it's hard, and you know, it's something that I grapple with all the time. But anyway, let's see what people have to say. I'm curious because let's see. Brandon Valenzuela says, "We don't talk about The Last Jedi." You know, but here's the thing. In my mind, one of the things about The Last Jedi, I don't think The Last Jedi it works at all. Like all of it. But I really enjoyed where Luke was at and seeing his story, because it wasn't what we would expect. But what I would like to have seen would be a 3-movie trilogy where that shows him where he was and deal with the myth of the Jedi and the way they did, but then have him sort of come to a different place. I thought that the story that was being told in The Last Jedi, as far as Luke was concerned, was really fascinating, but it was so quick and so short. I mean, that's the same way that when Tyrion and Varys come up with this idea that they're on either side of the fence based in what they think about Daenerys, that would have been a whole season. You know, they would have been vying throughout the control structure of the entire Westeros political community to try and win people over, and it would have been interesting to see where it wound up, where it went. I don't know. Raven is here. He says, "Good afternoon, Rob. Have you pontificated today?" I think, Raven, every day I'm pontificating. Raven sends us the word of the day at the John Campea show, and pontificating was one of the words today, which I thought was very funny. So that you're very funny, Raven. Keep up the good work. I really like the word of the day. Josh Zoll is here. He sends in a super chat. Josh, thank you. I appreciate that. Factual Opinion says, what do you think of Turnabout Intruder? I know people hate that episode, but I really enjoyed seeing William Shatner acting like a crazy person. I love Kirk. Well, for those of you who don't know, Turnabout Intruder was the very last episode of Star Trek, the original series. And in a nutshell, there is a woman that Kirk used to be involved with named Dr. Janice Lester. And the Enterprise goes and picks Janice Lester and her long-suffering, the man who loves her, up from an archaeological expedition. And it turns out they found an ancient alien technology that allows people to switch their personalities, their essence. It's never really explained, with another person. And Dr. Janice Lester, who is bitterly jealous and wanted to be a starship captain herself, switches her essence with William Shatner. So basically, William Shatner then plays himself as if he was taken over by a woman, by Janice Lester. And his performance in the episode is pretty amazing. And there's a lot of people, I don't know if those people who are very much in the woke brigade today would like that episode. It's certainly not considered a high watermark from the original series, but it's really interesting, especially now, because it deals literally with gender roles and what they all mean, and can you swap those roles? And it's fascinating from today's perspective, but a lot of people will get tripped up on how perhaps politically incorrect it might be. But it's very interesting, and certainly a reflection of where were we at as a culture in America in 1969. Where were our gender roles, when bras were being burned in the streets? Turnabout Intruder is a very interesting look at that. Alexander Wilson is here. He's a great supporter of this channel, also on the John Campea show too. So it's always happy to see Alexander here. Alexander says, the great Jay-Z said, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. Game of Thrones season 8 is averaging 43 million viewers per episode. Why are we listening to Twitter and YouTube and not the growing viewership? Well, I don't think that viewership has ever correlated to necessarily quality. Remember, this is also a historic season of television. Whether Game of Thrones is good or bad, it's a cultural phenomenon, and people don't want to be left out. And it's part of our culture, and it's been running for 8 years. Actually, the show has been it's been running for a decade. We skipped a year, so it's been running longer than 8 years, almost 10 years. And I don't think it's sort of out of the realm of anything to think that it's popular. People want to get in and watch it. I think pundits and the people, longtime viewers, and we're going to see where Game of Thrones is. Where does it sit in the pantheon of great pop culture shows? We don't know. Now, what I find really interesting is I am not here to necessarily criticize or tell you. I can tell you my perspective. I mean, I think that most people would think that, especially if you binge watch Game of Thrones, people are going to binge watch Game of Thrones in the future. That's where I would love to see when somebody reevaluates this show and watches it in 10 years. Because what I've often found is that when we're removed from pop culture for a time, we have all these expectations going into it now. But to me, the real test is when you come back and you watch it 10 years from now, when the hype has died down, and there's going to be people who are 10 years old now who have never seen Game of Thrones, and they're going to discover Game of Thrones in college. I want to know what those people are going to say. Is the story that is being told in Game of Thrones, does it endure the test of time? I would bet you not. I would bet you that especially this last season, if people watch Game of Thrones beginning to end in 10 years, they're going to be perplexed by how it ends, because the way the show was structured and the way the stories were told, it was all about interpersonal relationships, and the spectacle was something they saved. Now the interpersonal relationships. I mean, what's really interesting is we saw in this, I'll give you a perfect example. This last episode, we had all of these characters come together, and I was waiting for Sir Davos, who watched Serena burned at the stake. And now we never see a moment where he's watching other children being burned at the stake. They don't tie in what's going. We don't know what Jon Snow thinks about what's been happening here. We get a few. The personal nature of the story Game of Thrones is telling, I think, has been lost in this season. But I could be wrong. I'm willing to admit I'm wrong, but time will tell. It'll be really interesting in 10 years to read what people think of Game of Thrones now. Look, I loved Game of Thrones. I was even a staunch defender of last season. I loved Game of Thrones. I think I'm baffled, perplexed by how this season, I love the first 2 episodes of this season. I'm actually baffled by where we've gone for episodes 3, 4, and 5. It seems like a completely different show because where are the characters that I'm following? Where are the characters that I've loved? And everyone talks about, oh, well, I don't want to go down that Game of Thrones rabbit hole, but we'll see. Willow Yang says, when will you have your John Wick versus Neo hot toy fight? Will it happen in real life or in the Matrix? Well, I'll tell you what. I don't own the John Wick hot toy, has not been released yet. I don't know. As far as I know, no one is in possession of it. So I think the soonest we'll get it in America is, at least, even if people started acquiring in Asia now, it's going to take 3-4 months to even get it. Now, Neo, I have not ordered. Maybe if my mom sends me a check for my birthday or something, I'll order Neo. I really want that figure badly. I just haven't picked it up yet. I haven't gone to the Sideshow website and dropped the green on it. But believe me, I think it's going to be great to have Neo and John Wick up against it. Darth Suthia says, hey, Mr. B. Masura. That's, of course, the Mothra song. It's very funny to me. A lot of my new subscribers and people, there's been a lot of unkind comments, but that's to be expected. There's a lot of people that thought I was lying about seeing Godzilla, which why would I lie about that? But it's funny. And there were a lot of people that didn't believe that I did see Godzilla King of the Monsters. I did see it, by the way, just to be clear. Stubble McShave says, one of the best character-centric Star Trek episodes is Duet from season 1 of Deep Space Nine. That is actually the penultimate episode of season 1 of Deep Space Nine. It's a chamber play focusing on war crimes, PTSD, revenge, and forgiveness. Stubble is absolutely right. I think the first season of Deep Space Nine, in my mind, is pretty rough. I love the pilot. I think Emissary is probably the best of all of the modern Star Trek pilots. I love Emissary, and I love Duet, and I love the final episode of Deep Space Nine's first season, In the Hands of the Prophets. The show started to get really interesting, and those were all stories that really dealt with what Deep Space Nine became, its sort of milieu. But I agree, Duet, Harris Yulin is in that episode. What a fantastic hour of television that is. Certainly one of the high water marks of Deep Space Nine. It was the first time I think Deep Space Nine was really as great as it could be. Fantastic. Stubble McShave says, love Moonraker until space. Verisimilitude, goodbye. Well, I don't know, man. I mean, what about in that glass factory in Venice? But yeah, there's a lot of lack of verisimilitude, but at least they did things like they deal with gravity. But yes, watching the Space Marines come out of the back of the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and it was a little crazy, but you know what? I'll go with it. Look, I as much as they call me the gatekeeper of verisimilitude, which is very true, there are times when I understand if the intent is there and it all works. And look, the beginning of that movie, when the Moonraker shuttle blasts off the 747, which really couldn't happen, the way that it showed, and then the 747 just kind of falls like this. It's a Derek Meddings model effect. I love it because I love that kind of thing, especially when I was a kid. But I will never defend the verisimilitude of Moonraker. That doesn't mean I have a soft spot in my heart for it. I mean, it does mean that because I do. Let's see. Emmanuel Ericart says, how do you think we will work better? Oh, wait. What will work better? what will work better? A Highlander series remake. Hang on. How do you think it will? I'm gonna have to let me fix the grammar here. I think this is what you're asking me. What will be better as a Highlander remake, a series or a movie? I think it was a world with rich lore and great mystery, ignoring the sequels. Look, I love Highlander. Russell Mulcahy's original Highlander, I think, is great. It's kind of silly, but I do love it. I love the way it was shot. Highlander is one of the first real music video products of the 80s in terms of film, because Russell Mulcahy he directed a lot of Duran Duran's early videos, and Highlander is so influenced by music videos, the cinematography, the storytelling, the scene transitions, all of it. But I think probably a movie. I mean, of course, we've had a series. I would love to see, if you're going to remake Highlander, I guess. I mean, I'd love to see a film. But I think that the style is a big part of what made Highlander successful, and I'd like to see that style sort of retained. Aaron H. says, it seemed like they shoved 3 season-long stories into 6 episodes. Diminished the emotional impact of everything for me. I missed the character interaction. I agree with you. I do too, because that's what Game of Thrones was. And that the thread I read yesterday at the beginning of yesterday's show, I thought really nailed it, is that they changed. I think what people are really responding to is they love the characters. They love the character interplay, and the character interplay that they loved has been lacking from this season. I mean, we're arguing about whether Dany should have destroyed King's Landing. Look, I don't think that she should have done this. It didn't make sense. And people, it was making her crazy. And it was foreshadowed since the first season. No, what was foreshadowed was that she might be able to break away from being the crazy queen. And we saw her chain her dragons up for killing one human child. It wasn't foreshadowed that she was supposed to become the evil queen. That was what she was supposed to become. That's what Targaryens become. So the fact they made her go crazy wasn't about foreshadowing. That's the lazy, easy way out. What they should have done is had her figure out, like, she should have started on a rampage and then stopped herself, thinking, what am I doing? What is it I want? What's unfortunate is they've turned her into a cartoon villain. Talk about a mustache twirling villain. In her case, she'll twirl her braids. And it was exactly what everybody expected to happen since the first season. Those people are like, see, it was supposed to happen. But that's not great storytelling. What's great storytelling? It's not even about subverting. The expectations were that she really did go crazy. But going crazy is not the story that was being told about her. At least that's not the way that I saw it. Alexander Wilson says, if viewership doesn't correlate quality or people enjoying, then why did the last season of Breaking Bad average ratings triple for the last season? Because Breaking Bad, like Game of Thrones, has become a cultural event. And the people that weren't part of that cultural event while it was happening are now able to, because it's been in the media, are able to jump on and see what it's all about. And that's to be expected. Star Trek: The Next Generation went out with the highest ratings it ever had. And back by the time Star Trek: The Next Generation went off the air in its 7th season, it was a cause celeb. A lot of the media was everywhere. 1994 was arguably the biggest year for Star Trek ever, when you had Next Generation going off the air, you had Deep Space Nine on, you had Generations being made, and you had whisperings of a new Star Trek series for UPN. So it becomes the reason the ratings are going up, because it's a cultural event that's ending. And that can't be denied. I don't think Game of Thrones has been one of the most watched television shows around the world. It's one of the most successful TV shows ever. This bump in rating has nothing to do with quality. It has to do with the fact that it's a cultural event, a pop culture event that's ending, and people want to be a part of it. Tony Reyes says, cool RX-78 in the back. Can we take a look? What would you like to see from the live action Gundam movie being made? It's funny. People love this. I love this. Tony, you know what this is? Okay, for those of you, if you're not a Gundam fan, this is the classic from 1979 RX-78 First Gundam. Now, I have this. This is actually a coffee cup. You're supposed to drink coffee out of this. I love this because it looked so good, and I would love to get a model of the RX-78 this size. I've had figures that were this size. Well, not quite this size, but there have been figures this big. But yeah, I want. Look, I love Mobile Suit Gundam. Mobile Suit Gundam is all about the cost. It's a great science fiction epic that, of course, there's even lightsabers in Mobile Suit Gundam. But Mobile Suit Gundam is a great anime series about the cost and price of war. And I've always loved Gundam. If you guys haven't gotten into Gundam, it debuted in 1979, so this is the 40th anniversary of Gundam. It's a huge franchise to get involved with. There's talk now Brian K. Vaughan is supposed to be writing a live-action Gundam movie. I think it'd be really tough to do as a movie. It has to be done as multiple films, but I'm a big fan of Gundam. There's multiple continuities, but if you want to get into it, the continuity you want to know about is the Universal Century continuity, and I'm a huge fan. And I just hope they maintain. It's a very serious look at war, and it's brutal. People die en masse in that show. I hope that they stay true to it. For those of you who might not want to go back, I would suggest, if you want a taste of Gundam, watch Gundam Unicorn, which is a recent series. It's all available on Blu-ray. You can find it streaming. Gundam Unicorn, I thought, was great. It takes place, I believe, 100 years after the beginning of the Gundam continuity, but it's awesome. I love Gundam. Darth Suthius says, here's another trope I roll my eye at. Character A meets ominous character B. Who are you? Character B answers with, the question is, who are you? Geez. Yeah, that's a trope we've seen many times. I don't disagree with you there. Let's see. Wow, there's lots of people here. You guys are I love it. A lot of new people. Nick B says, "Hey RMB, it's Candy Van Man. Have you seen the Godzilla Infinity War trailer mashup? Best trailer mashup ever. I also pre-ordered the Endgame Thanos hot toy." Well, Nick B, you should have. That's great. I have not seen the Endgame Godzilla King of the Monsters mashup, but I'm going to watch it. And I too pre-ordered the Endgame Thanos hot toy, which we have to wait like a year and a half to get. But I can't wait to get it. You know, I pre-ordered the Infinity War Thanos, and the latest I've heard, people have received it already, but you know, it gets literally on the slow boat from China. It comes over, so it takes us like 3 months here in the States to get them, but it's supposed to arrive sometime in June, maybe. I haven't gotten anything to notice about it. I mean, it's funny because I had ordered. I had like 4 figures on order. The only one that I heard anything about was Doctor Strange. You know. Aaron H said, wish they had the Night King go to King's Landing instead of Winterfell. That way they could have had the battle against the dead for the throne. I can dream. Well, I think that's very interesting because, again, what was the meaning of it all? Like, why do people include story elements because it's supposed to mean something? Now, the Night King and the whole idea of the White Walkers, I thought that was a problem for all of Westeros. And the idea is, in my mind, I mean, if you want to look at it as an allegory for global warming, how are we as a disparate group of people with all of our disparate political systems and all of our ridiculous infighting and tariffs and all this, global warming is going to come for us whether you believe in it or not, whether you believe in the science or not. We're all going to deal with it. And then everyone's going to say, wait a minute. No, we all knew it was coming. We just choose not to deal with it. And the White Walkers, it could have been an interesting way to examine those issues within the context of Game of Thrones, because what I thought was really interesting about the White Walker threat, and I've been saying this the whole time, is that the reason Game of Thrones was so rich is because of all the character interplay, because of the machinations, whereas the Night King and the White Walkers had no connection really to anybody. They were an unstoppable force, a force of nature. That was the Watchers on the Wall knew, and Jon Snow knew that these were coming. The wildlings knew, the free folk knew that these people were out there, these creatures were out there. But the rest of Westeros, it was something that was sort of removed from everything else that we were watching. And I never thought it was really something to deal with. And the fact that, you know, they bring a zombie down to King's Landing and show everybody, and Cersei's like, nah. Let him deal with it. So the question I ask is that why were the White Walkers in Game of Thrones at all? At the end of the day, what did their inclusion in the story mean? And why not just kill the Night King 3 seasons ago? What did the inclusion of that storyline at Winterfell have to do with the overarching? The show is called Game of Thrones. So it's asking you a question: who is going to sit on the Iron Throne, and why do they deserve to be there? And what's interesting is, as they've removed players, we're now at who's left to play the game. Is it really a game anymore? Well, now there needs to be somebody to take over in the power vacuum that's been left by Dany's fiery apocalypse. And what does the Night King have to do with any of that? Did that belong in the story? Certainly, George R. R. Martin dealt with the Night King very differently in the books. Darth Suthius says, ever watch Ancient Aliens? It's my jam. That sort of thing fascinates me, makes me question everything, and I can't get enough of it. That and Cosmos. Well, here's the funny thing about Ancient Aliens. I grew up as a kid. I'd go to the Mercer Island. I'm from Mercer Island, Washington. The Mercer Island Public Library, and I read every single book I could get my hands on strange phenomenon, whether it was spontaneous human combustion, whether it was UFOs and ancient aliens. I read it all. And when I was a kid, I don't know how many of you remember this, but there was a distribution company called Sun Classic Pictures. And Sun Classic Pictures released all of these crazy movies. And the first one I remember, I think it was their first one, was The Outer Space Connection. And if I remember, Rod Serling narrated it. It dealt with ancient aliens, the lines at Nazca, the pyramids, and how all of our great endeavors were really alien influenced. Then they did The Mysterious Monsters. It was about the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. And then they had like the Lincoln Conspiracy and In Search of Historic Jesus. And I mean, they made the one fictional movie they made was a movie called Hangar 18, which was an alien movie with a rectangular flying saucer. But yeah, so I was obsessed with ancient aliens as a kid. Not so much now, but I'm still, if you look at the megalith structures around the world, there's still a lot of structures from ancient civilizations, whether it's Easter Island or whether there's places in the ancient world where they've got stones that were so huge that we can't figure out how they got moved. That stuff was all real. And I don't know if it was aliens, but it's certainly interesting that how do we not know how a lot of these things were done? But yes, I have an affinity. I have watched some ancient alien shows, but it was something I was so into when I was a kid, and now I sort of debunked it all in my own mind. David Galvez says, "Hey Rob, I've never read a full comic book, but I love the MCU. What's a good comic book to pick up for the first-time reader?" David, I've got one for you. Pick up a Marvel comic book since you love the MCU. Pick up a comic book called Marvels. It's just called Marvels, and it was painted by Alex Ross. It's a pretty famous comic series, but it deals with how does the man on the street. You don't have to know a lot about continuity because you'll know enough from the MCU to get everything that the story says. But what does the man on the street think about living in a world where all of these characters exist and interact with the world around us? Marvels. I guarantee you will enjoy it and get it. Report back. I'll be curious to hear, as a non-comic book reader, what do you think of Marvels? Alexander Wilson says, I believe the RoboCop future was more of a better view of the world than Star Trek. Detroit now looks no different than the one in the movie. Corporate overlords, recessions. It was scary accurate. I totally agree. I think RoboCop was very forward thinking, and even the commercials, the 6000 SUX. I mean, it came here. The media breaks. RoboCop's one of the most prescient science fiction films ever made, I think, and I completely agree with you. It's terrific. Unfortunately, it's sad. But remember, even in the Star Trek universe, there was nuclear war in the 21st century, and we pulled ourselves up by our britches and got out of there. Alexander Wilson also says, "R.I.P. to Tim Conway. Growing up, I didn't know Tim Conway. I didn't watch the Carol Burnett show, even though my last name was Burnett, and I am not related to Carol Burnett in any way, shape, or form. But Tim Conway was a mainstay on the Carol Burnett show. But I knew Tim Conway from the Disney film The Apple Dumpling Gang, and The Apple Dumpling Gang rides again. He passed away. He lived a good life, though. I mean, he did live a good long life. So kudos to Mr. Tim Conway. It was great. It was great having him. By the way, there was a chat from yesterday that I missed, and it was I want to cover it from the King of Scotland. The King of Scotland sent me a super chat, and he said, "Do you think Drogon will turn on Dany for Jon?" Ooh, that's interesting. Last King of Scotland, the King of Scotland. I don't know. Probably not, but you never know. I mean, the Targaryen blood. It'll be interesting to see. I think that's something to ponder, perhaps, because there is, I call it the Drogon problem. Even Arya, if Arya Stark somehow manages to kill Dany, what is that going to do to Drogon? And is Drogon smart enough to know what he's done? I don't know. I would let Drogon just hang out in King's Landing because he has a lot of food there. I mean, I don't know how dragons like, or if they like their people charbroiled, or what's left when you get hit. But there's probably a lot of people that weren't burned to a crisp, and maybe there's a lot for Drogon to eat. I worry about Drogon. I hope he has enough to eat. Darth Suthius says, Mr. C is skeptical about Adam Warlock showing up in the MCU. Your thoughts? I can't wait. Very curious how this version will be and what storyline he'll have. No, I could see Adam Warlock showing up. I mean, they're going to look with the Eternals and the Deviants. They're going to expand their cosmic story. I mean, I don't know. Do the Eternals, are they on Earth? I don't know what they're going to do. But if they're going to bring in more Eternals and more Celestials and James Gunn's coming back, I think we're going to see Adam Warlock. I have no idea what they're going to do with it all. But I think the cosmic realm, the universe, is going to be pretty interesting in the MCU. I can't wait to see more of it. But I don't know what they're going to actually do. It'll be interesting to see. Murray Reich says, do you like Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone? I think it's fine, but I like the 60s one better because the episodes are shorter and straight to the point. Oh, Murray. There was an episode, I think it was the last episode I watched. It was called Not All Men. I was like stunned again, like what our reader was saying or watcher was saying about Star Trek Discovery. It was the most, in a way, basically, here's the plot of this Twilight Zone episode. Meteorites land on Earth, and they cause all the men in this town to become assholes, to just amplify their assholishness. They become brutes, murderers, rapists. Seriously, that was the story, that the men went crazy. Like, and the insinuation was this, and the women were not affected at all. I watched this story and I'm like, wow. Twilight Zone always had a political agenda, or the stories had different agendas and things that they wanted to convey. The monsters are due on Maple Street comes to mind. But what's really interesting is all this Twilight Zone episode did was basically say men are dicks. It was written by a woman and directed by a woman, and that's fine. You can say men are dicks, but the Twilight Zone usually had something more to say. I watched this episode and I'm like, I didn't mind that it was an hour, but I have not been impressed. But again, I have not. What we've seen from the new Twilight Zone has been, to me and to my mind, very disappointing. It's a lot of it's beautifully made though, and next week's episode looks pretty interesting. I'm tuning in, but again, I just wonder if the people that are writing the episodes are up to the task. If they really understand, you go back and you watch so many of these Twilight Zone episodes are so classic and they work so well, that it's disheartening, I think, to see what we're getting with the new Twilight Zone. Uncle Remus says, where are the sci-fi episodes in the new Twilight Zone? Hard to believe Rod Serling's family was okay with this version. Yeah, meteorites coming from space, I guess, makes it sci-fi, but I don't really think so. I mean, what was really interesting is is that Twilight Zone episode, Not All Men, was a premise. It wasn't so much a story. It was like a first act. And again, I think, look, a lot of the TV writers that are working today, they came up writing for television or whatever. And I think I am looking for the literary to be put back into the science fiction that we're getting. That's why I think I respond so much to The Expanse. The Expanse is a show that's based on books. They're following the books. So there's something interesting going on there. But the new Twilight Zone needs much more of a literary component to it, at least the way I see it now. Just Plain Steve says, I enjoy picking apart shows I love as much as anyone, but shouldn't we just enjoy the story that's being told to us? We need to see how it plays out. Look, I'm the first guy that will say that to you. But what's really difficult is when you're hearing a great story that's being told, and then in the 11th hour, the story is not told as well anymore. And you wonder, like, well, wait a minute. In a way, it feels like a betrayal. I thought the entire last season of Lost was an incredible betrayal. It was a show that I should not have liked at all, but I was really into it. And then the last season, I'm like, oh, they really don't know what their own show is about. The Emperor had no clothes. And I was very disappointed by that. It bummed me out. Well, anyway, everyone, I think that I will bring this chat to a close. It's been a great chat. I want to thank all of my new subscribers for subscribing. I mean, and if you haven't, I noticed it's interesting that 50% of these, according to analytics, 50% of the people that watch these chats are not subscribers. So, hey, it would help me out if you subscribe. That would be great. Hit the little button notifications. But more importantly, I love the fact I want to thank everybody for participating the way you participate. It's great. I've got people like my moderators that I met because they were letter writers and participants here, which I think are great. And I really have enjoyed the community that we're building. It's pretty great. And the letters people are sending. And please, if you want to share things with the Post-Geek Singularity, go to the Burnettwork.net. If you have a tattoo or a short story or artwork or even a motorcycle. Somebody sent us their Captain America motorcycle. It's badass. It's like an Avengers Endgame motorcycle. It's totally current. Check it out. It's on the Imagination Connoisseur page of the Burnettwork.net, my website. Just keep sending me more of that stuff. I want to share it all. What you guys are doing is amazing out there. And the international crew, people like Joseph and Vesna and everybody, and Willow Yang up in California, up in Canada, trying to get her PhD going. But it's great. I love having you all here, and I want to thank you all for being great participants and growing the channel and sending me the letters. But anyway, I just wanted to bid you all farewell for the day. And remember, everybody that you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. Tomorrow, I'll be back on my birthday chatting. I don't really have any plans for my birthday, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I do want to thank you all. I want to thank Lucky Tiger for sponsoring this channel. If you want to go to Lucky Tiger, getluckytiger.com and use the code PGS for Post-Geek Singularity when you check out. And you can get 20% off your entire order. So thanks very much for that. And thank you all to my new subscribers. And that's it. And I bid you all, as always, to have a better day. Thanks for being here.